So we've been using Google Drive since 2011, but in all that time, we've never enabled a feature that we're going to now enable now that Google Drive is going to be our primary repository for business data. That feature is called shared drives, not to be confused with shared folders, which many of you have probably already been taking advantage of for many, many years. That's when you right-click a file or a folder and you share it with somebody. And whenever you do that, the data appears under shared with me if it gets shared with you, for instance. So here's an example of a file that was shared with me. I see it there. By the way, I'm going to change the view here. I kind of like the file list where you can see who shared it with you and on what date. Shared drives instead are, if you've ever had the situation where somebody's left the college, they owned a lot of your department's data. All of that ownership needs to be transferred to somebody else now. It breaks who it's shared with, or you have to copy it out, or it just sort of makes a mess. This makes it so that that data is owned by the central system and not by a human being. So there's a department folder that's centrally owned, and when the person leaves, none of the permissions change. We actually did that with Box. We made folders for just about every department that was making use of Box, and we had it owned by an account called Box Admin. Any folder for which that was the case, we've now created shared drives in Google Drive to match those. We just copied those permissions over from Box to Google Drive. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be the way that you would like for it to be, because maybe somebody at some point created a folder in Box and they shared it with you, and from that point on, that was your department folder, and it really is owned by somebody. That would also be a good candidate for creating a shared drive. Right now, only IT can create a shared drive, so if you find that we didn't create the right folder, or you want to change things around, or you want to rename it, or you want to make multiple shared drives for each functional area, just email us, helpdesk@emerson.edu, and we can set that up for you. So if you have a shared drive shared with you right now, if you're a member of a shared drive is what they call it, you'll see shared drives on the left. If you don't see it, that just means that there are no shared drives shared with you at the moment, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So here's a training shared drive that I've created, and if I right-click and go to Manage Members, this kind of looks like when you share folders and files before. And if I search for myself, for instance, the permissions look a little bit different. There's still viewer and commenter, just like before, but now there's contributor, content manager, and manager. You can think of content manager as like an editor, somebody who can delete files, somebody who can edit them, etc. But only a manager can manage permissions. And only at the topmost level of a shared drive do managers exist. So this is the only place where you define who's going to set permissions from that point forward. And this is really important to understand. Anytime you set permissions on a shared drive or any of its shared folders, that person that you just added is going to have access all the way down that file path from that point forward. You can't, for instance, 2 or 3 folders deep remove them. They're going to have access from that point on. So if you wanted, let's say, to create a VP area, let's say administration and finance, and then underneath that, there's information technology. So if administration and finance is the shared drive, there'd be a few managers. And then under information technology, that would be shared with all of the IT staff. And that would appear underneath their shared with me. So it would manifest in the form of a shared folder. And none of those staff would see it under shared drive. And only the people who are members at the top, that topmost layer of the shared drive, could manage permissions from there. And so just as an example, if you wanted to create a subfolder within your shared drive, you right-click, subfolder 1, and then right-click and go to share. That should look familiar to you. This is just folder sharing like anything else. But unlike typical folder sharing, you see that the permissions match those of shared drives and not of typical shared folders. And notice also that manager is no longer an option because managers can only exist at the topmost level of a shared drive. So just keep that in mind. And as always, if you leave the notify people checked, they'll receive an email that says, we've shared a new folder with you, and they'll be able to see it in their Google Drive. If you uncheck that, you can still make a hyperlink out of it, and then you can get the link. And you could share the link directly with them on Slack or via email or in a document or however you'd like to distribute it. This really gets into how your department wants to structure and organize your data. This is a great opportunity to kind of reorganize and restructure everything in a way that's logical and findable and searchable. And permissioned accurately. For small departments, it might make sense to make the shared drive, add everybody as a content manager and maybe a few people as managers and call it a day. For other larger areas, it might make sense to have just a few people as managers of the shared drive and then create shared folders for each functional area. It really depends. One of the things you want to consider is if you're trying to delegate who can set permissions across the folder structure, again, only managers can do that in a shared drive setting. So you may want to create more shared drives, maybe a shared drive per functional area, especially if you're relying on the Google Drive for desktop application, because as we talked about before, shared folders don't show up there. Shared drives do, on the other hand. And if you're really security conscious, if you go to the settings gear, by default, we have all three of these checked. The first one is people outside of Emerson College can be added to files. So what that's saying is not necessarily that you're adding or not adding external people right now, but that managers could share files and folders with external viewers if they wanted to. So if you wanted to at least let that be an option for maybe a subfolder, share that with a contractor, that's totally doable. Keep in mind that outside person does need to have a Google account. They have to sign up for a Google account in order to gain access to this stuff. But if you want to eliminate the possibility that an external person could ever see these files, you might want to uncheck that. People who aren't shared drive members can be added to the files. Yeah, you're going to need that checked if anybody who's not a member at the topmost level of the shared drive is going to have access to any of your subfolders within the shared drive. And then finally, viewers and commenters can download, print, and copy files. If you wanted to make it so that anybody with view permissions could only preview the file and not take them offline or not make a copy of them, you might want to consider unchecking that. And even though people who have access to folders within shared drives won't see that under shared drives, and they'll see it under shared with me, anything that lives within a shared drive will have a small icon next to it that says, this is inside of a shared drive. It looks like these little people, but it has kind of a block around it. And that at least would give you the indication, this is inside of a shared drive somewhere. And finally, one last comment. I know that over the years, some people have asked for shared mailboxes or shared accounts, things like admission at emerson.edu, and that has files in it, or registrar at emerson.edu, that has files in it. This would be a great time to convert that kind of data over to a shared drive and kind of get everything in one place where your department can find your data.